Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. Today we're going to look at this thing here. It's a computer stick by a company called AWOW. And despite this very small form factor, this is a full-fledged Windows PC. Now, as you can probably imagine, this is no PC powerhouse. Obviously, there are going to be some concessions when you shrink down a computer to be this small. But that's the thing, the size of this really does open up some new possibilities. And I've explored this in other ways. For example, there's a Super Console X stick. But this is kind of that concept on steroids. This thing is literally a full computer, which means you can put the entire Batocera operating system on a microSD card and boot from that. And as you can guess, that's what we're going to do in this video today. We're going to create a Batocera machine with this little PC stick. And along the way, we're going to see how it performs, and I think you might be a little surprised. So, without any further delay, let's jump into it. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, the company sent me this review unit via Amazon. And as always, these opinions are all my own and they're not seeing this video before I release it. On the back you get a quick spec sheet. You can see that it runs an Intel Gemini Lake processor, which is the J4105. This model also has 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage. And all the other things you would expect, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, USB ports, as well as dual monitor support. So now let's take a minute and look at the passmark scores for this processor. And of course, they're not going to compare at all to a regular PC, but pay attention here to the single thread rating. It's 1096. In general, if you want to play any GameCube games, you want at least 1000 for your single thread rating, but really 1600 is ideal for some of the harder to play GameCube games. And for PS2, you want at least 2000 for your single thread rating. So walking into this review, I knew it was going to play maybe a couple GameCube games, but I wasn't really sure how well it would do. Let's go ahead and open up the box and see what we have inside. Inside you're going to find a spec sheet. It's not going to have a lot in it, just your packing list and some specifications. And here's the device itself. Most of the ports are going to be on one side. It uses USB-C for power, it has 2 USB-A ports, and then the microSD slot as well as a power button. On the other side there are connectors for a mini DisplayPort, Ethernet, as well as a Kensington lock, which no one ever uses. And that's really about it. That's all there is on the device. It does have a hump here on the back. I think that's to make space for the Ethernet connection. Okay, let's see what else is in the box. So you have a US power adapter, and then a couple other ones here. I think these are intergalactic. I think this one's from Mars, and I think this is from Jupiter. But yeah, if you need those connections, they have those as well. Assembly is super easy. You just pop it in place. And it looks like the output is 5 volts and 3 amps. Also included in the box is an HDMI extension cable. Now, in terms of size, I couldn't really think of how to compare it, so I just grabbed a stick of butter. So if you've ever used an 8-ounce stick of butter, these are almost the same size. Obviously, the computer stick is a little bit thinner, and nowhere near as tasty as Kerrygold butter. Now, this device has no active cooling, and based on this design, you might think that this is an aluminum shell to kind of push out some of that heat, but it's not, it's a plastic shell. That being said, I never had any issues with heating during my testing. So let's take a look at what it looks like when we've plugged everything into it. Here I have an Ethernet cable, a power cord, as well as a USB flash drive. And honestly, altogether, it's not too unsightly. And given the fact that I'm going to use a microSD card for my storage, I don't even need that USB flash drive. But one of my major concerns is how much weight I would be putting on this HDMI connector. I'm worried that plugging it into a TV and having that weight kind of pull it down is going to damage my TV or the PC stick itself. So in that regard, I would recommend using that HDMI extender. It's just going to make things a little bit easier. Now, when it comes to controllers, you have several options. For example, you could use a Bluetooth connection. Me personally, I'm going to use this one here. This is the R100 Pro from Big One. And this is going to allow you to connect things like a PS4 controller or an Xbox One controller directly into the device. And so that just really simplifies things without having to mess with Bluetooth. So that's what I'm going to do here. So let's go ahead and power it up and see what it's like. And when you first power on the device, it's going to ask you to set up Windows. And I'm not going to bore you with all those details. I'm just going to assume that you know how to turn on a computer and set up Windows. I mean, if my parents can do it, I'm pretty sure you can do it too. Now, I'm going to focus mostly on emulation with this video, but you could use this as a regular PC too. So for example, you could install Steam or the GOG Galaxy app, and then access your game library and install games. And I tried out a few lightweight Steam games like Sonic Mania, as well as Grand Theft Auto 3, and to be honest, they played fine. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to be able to turn on Counter-Strike and tell you whether or not you're getting good performance. But if you wanted to do some very, very light gaming, this is potentially an option. Now I should note here, I couldn't get the controller to work, so I'm actually using a keyboard and mouse to control right here, and that's why I just ran that guy over. I totally didn't want to do that, but I did it. So honestly, when it comes to the Windows side of things, you could do some gaming on it, but I would more use it for a productivity machine more than anything. Maybe browse the web and check your email, things like that. When it comes to gaming, I would recommend using something like Batocera, so let's set that up. First, let's install an app called miniDP, and I'll have links to this in the written guide, which will be in the video description below. And then of course, we're also going to want to download an image of Batocera. For this, you're going to want to install the standard desktop image. Once you've downloaded the image and you've installed miniDP, let's go ahead and flash that image to a microSD card. And this is super simple. You go and you navigate to where the image is, and you don't even have to unzip it or anything. And then for select target, just pick your microSD card. From there, just select flash. It'll take maybe 10 minutes to flash the entire thing. And then once it's done, you'll have some pop-ups. Just go ahead and cancel out of all of these. And at this point, all you have to do is restart the PC. Now make sure the keyboard and mouse that you have hooked up to the PC is USB connected and not Bluetooth connected. And as soon as the PC restarts and you see the AWOW logo, go ahead and press the delete key on your USB keyboard. That's going to take you into the BIOS menu of this computer. From here, just tab over to the boot tab, and then near the bottom you're going to see the fixed boot order priorities. Go ahead and enter into this menu, and then make your number one boot option the USB device UEFI generic storage device. That's actually your microSD card. Once you've done that, go ahead and press F4 to save and exit. Now you've told the computer to boot from the microSD card before it boots into Windows. And so now when the computer restarts, it's going to resize the partitions in the microSD card, and then it's going to boot into Batocera. And this is what it looks like here. At this point, all of the hard work is done. We just need to load up some games and have some fun. Now, when you first get into Batocera, there's a few things you can do to improve the user experience. Probably the first thing I like to do is go into the sound settings and then turn off that front-end music. Personally, I don't like a bunch of music playing while I'm navigating through my games. But you might like that, no judgments here. Another thing I recommend doing is going into the updates and download section and downloading some new themes. And Batocera has plenty of themes, and I like that they show you little previews as you're browsing through them. So any of these themes work great, but I'm just going to pick this one here, Next Level Remix. Once it's done downloading and installing, you just go into the UI settings and change out your theme. And there you go, we now have a whole new look for Batocera. And I'm just going to stick with this one for the duration of this video, but there are plenty of other themes that you could use if you'd like. Another thing about Batocera is that they pre-install a bunch of open source games. And before I start adding my own games, I'm going to get rid of some of these open source ones first. So what I like to do is go into the All Games section, and then hold down the A button to bring up the game options. And within there, you'll see an option to delete the game. So I'm just going to go through and delete all of these. I'll keep Doom on there because that's the shareware version and that one's kind of fun. But for the rest, I'm just going to go through and delete them. And so now, once they've all been deleted, let's add our own games. Now with that keyboard still plugged into your computer, press the F1 key. This is going to bring up the File Explorer. And this is going to allow you to navigate through the file menu of the Batocera image. Next thing you want to do is grab a USB flash drive or USB external hard drive and plug it into your computer. And this File Explorer will recognize it. You can see the Samsung T5 just showed up. And this is actually the hard drive I used with my NVIDIA Shield video. And inside here I have my BIOS and game files. So I'm just going to copy these over onto the microSD card. So first I'll go into the BIOS folder. I'm going to copy all of these BIOS files. And then I'm going to go into the actual Batocera BIOS folder and then paste them here. And just like that, I've moved over all the system files that are required for some consoles like PlayStation 1 and Sega CD and things like that. Next, I'm going to go into that USB hard drive again and start grabbing some games. For example, let me grab some 3DS games here. I'm just going to copy all of them. Then I'm going to go into the ROMs folder of the Batocera image, and then paste them into the 3DS folder here. Essentially, I'm just copying over files from my external hard drive over to the microSD card. And that's basically the whole process here. You just copy them from the external hard drive, then move them over to the microSD card. And if you ever get stuck along the way, there's a wiki page on the Batocera webpage that'll tell you exactly which file types are required, or how to set up any individual system that requires a little bit more than that. One thing to note with the File Explorer too, if you look on the bottom right, it'll actually show you how much free space you have available, which is really handy when you have limited space like a microSD card. Okay, now that we have everything moved over, let's go ahead and eject the external hard drive and then close this window. And initially you might not see that anything has changed. What you want to do is press Start, go into Game Settings, and then select Update Games List. And here we are. These are all the games that I've added to the microSD card. Just like that, I'm ready to rock. So two more things I recommend doing before you start playing. First is go into the game settings, and then under the smooth games option, set that to off. That's going to turn off by linear filtering and your games are going to look a little bit sharper. Additionally, I would go into the scraper settings, and then you can scrape all of the box art and other media for each of your games. And this might take a while to scrape all of the games, but once you're done, you're going to have box art and videos for each of your games as you navigate through them. Again, you're going to want to update your games list, but after that, it's going to look a lot prettier. Okay, so now let's move over and talk about game performance. We'll start with some of the easier stuff and move up from there. And as expected, your 8-bit and 16-bit systems are going to play just great, so things like NES are just going to be a cakewalk. And same thing with Super Nintendo, it doesn't matter which game you play, even the really hard ones, they're going to play just fine on this computer. So really, for the rest of this video, I'm going to focus on the harder systems, the ones that you can actually upscale and get a better resolution. So let's start with PlayStation 1. The newest version of Batocera, Batocera 32, allows you to use the DuckStation standalone emulator. And I really like this emulator. It does a really good job of allowing you to increase the resolution. What I found in general is that you can use a 5x resolution or a 1080p signal and still get really good performance with PlayStation 1. A few games here and there would have a little bit of a dip every once in a while, and so for those maybe you could do a 4x resolution instead. For example, with this game here, I did see it dip down to something like 55 frames per second every once in a while. So this one would probably benefit better from a 4x resolution. But for the most part, I would say 95% of games can play at 1080p, no problem. So let's move on to something else. Let's try arcade gameplay. Now for most of your classic arcade games, they're going to play buttery smooth. You're not going to have any performance issues going all the way up to some of your harder to emulate games. For example, things like Killer Instinct still played at full speed. It's really impressive. In fact, even Killer Instinct 2 played at full speed. I would get a dip every once in a while, but for the most part, it was perfect. Tekken also worked really well. I didn't get any audio, but that's a known issue with the MAME 2003 Plus core, so you could just try the MAME 2010 core instead and get full audio. Moving over to Final Burn Neo, this one did really well also. As you can see here, CPS 3 games like Street Fighter 3 did really well. And even some other classics like Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 played at a full frame rate. Now this game originally played at 54 frames per second, so that is the max frame rate. And you could also use the Final Burn Neo core to play Neo Geo games, and all of these played flawlessly as well. In general, I would say the arcade performance on this was really impressive. In fact, I think this little PC stick would do really well inside of a custom arcade cabinet. So if that's a project you've been contemplating, this might be a good solution. This is going to give you way better performance than something like a Raspberry Pi. Okay, moving over to Sega Saturn, performance here was a little bit mixed. For the most part, any game that I played using the Yaba-Sanshiro core did really well. You can see here Nights into Dreams is running at full speed. And this is with no upscaling, just using the native resolution. But yeah, all around, Yaba-Sanshiro did very well. It's not the most accurate core in the world, but it seems to work well. The problem is, some of the games that wouldn't work with Yaba-Sanshiro, for example Virtua Cop 2, I had to play it with the Beetle core, and as you can see here, it doesn't run at full speed. I'm only getting something like 35 frames per second. So long story short, I would say 90% of games are going to run really well. The other 10% just don't work on the Yaba-Sanshiro core, and therefore aren't going to work. Okay, let's talk a little bit about handheld systems for a few minutes. We'll start with Game Boy Advance. As expected, Game Boy Advance has no issues at all. It's going to run at full speed no matter what game you choose. But the next generation, Nintendo DS, does run into some issues. The default Nintendo DS setup is going to look like this. It's going to have these bezels around that kind of mimic the Nintendo DS in the first place. And this works fine, but the screen is a little bit small depending on the size of the TV you plug it into. So you could go into the RetroArch settings and then make them full screen like this, but as you can see, it's getting a lot of slowdown. I'm only getting about 48 frames per second instead of your typical 60. But luckily, there's also a standalone Melon DS emulator, and this is going to allow you to play at full screen, and you can also double the resolution to get a better picture too. So it takes a little bit of tweaking, but you can definitely get full screen and good playing Nintendo DS on this. Now, unfortunately, Nintendo 3DS is a different story. As you can see here, Metroid Samus Returns actually does play pretty well. It does take some performance hits, and it also has a little bit of screen tearing, but overall I would say it's an enjoyable experience. That being said, every other Nintendo 3DS game I tried was not an enjoyable experience. I was seeing frame rates as low as 10 frames per second on some of these games. Even games you wouldn't expect to play slowly like Tetris Axis still played really poorly. In general, with the exception of Metroid Samus Returns, I would not expect this machine to be able to play Nintendo 3DS at all. I really think we're just hitting the upper limit of what this thing can do. Okay, so let's move on, let's try Nintendo 64. And for this one, I'm happy to report the gameplay is just about flawless. Even when playing some of the harder to run games like Cruisin' USA, I'm still getting about 100% speed, as you can see on the bottom left corner. Even Killer Instinct Gold was playing really well. It would get some frame dips here and there, but overall, it was a really good experience. And of course, everyone wants to know how GoldenEye plays, and this one does play well. You're definitely going to see some drops in frame rate when you get into the larger open areas, but I would definitely say this is a playable experience on this PC stick. Okay, let's move on to Dreamcast now, and this one's a little bit tricky. Typically, I like to use the Redream emulator because it always seems to work really well. And sure enough, I am getting a good 60 frames per second on every game that I tried. The problem is that in the Redream settings, there is no option to upscale the resolution. But luckily, there's also the Flycast standalone emulator installed in Batocera. And here it's super easy to go into the settings and upscale the resolution to something a little bit better. So let's try 1280 by 960. And luckily, performance here is excellent, even with the upscaled resolution. I would say that there are some accuracy issues with this emulator. For example, you can see here with Ryu's Fireball, it's not looking very good. But for the most part, every other game seemed to work really well and not have any of those graphical issues. And I would say that Dreamcast was one of my favorite systems to play on this little PC stick because the performance was so good that it was basically an afterthought. I found myself as I was testing these games not even looking at the frame rate at all because I just assumed that it was working perfectly, and it was. And that's everybody's goal when it comes to emulation, when you don't have to sit there and fiddle with the numbers and everything just works. And I'll say with this little machine, Dreamcast just works. And along those same lines, PSP performance is really good too. By default, I set everything to 4x resolution, so a 1080p signal, and just like with Dreamcast, most of the games had no issues at all. Of course, any easy to play game, and even some of the middle tier games can run just fine at 4x resolution. But those harder ones to play, like Outrun 2006, do require you to drop it down to 3x resolution just to make sure you don't get any performance dips. And as you can see here, a 3x resolution with Outrun 2006 runs flawlessly. And if you're wondering about the God of War games, those also play well, but you do have to drop it down to 2x resolution. And the performance won't be perfect, but it is very good. You know, sometimes I wonder what this game is like after the first level. I've never actually seen it, but hey, here's the gameplay here. Okay, so let's move on to the final system. Here's Nintendo GameCube. Now, you can take some of the very easy systems like Alien Hominid, and it's going to play just perfectly. Even things like Mario Kart Double Dash is relatively smooth. I would get a little bit of jitters or stutters every once in a while, but far and away the GameCube experience was very enjoyable. I'm going to be conservative in my estimate and say that at least 50% of all GameCube games are going to play really well. But if you're not going to be too picky about perfect performance, like you don't want every single moment to be perfectly smooth, then I would say that at least 75% of the game's catalog are actually going to play really well. In general, I was actually very surprised at how well a lot of these GameCube games played. Given that passmark score, I thought that only maybe a couple were going to play. But it turns out that most of them did. Of course, the usual suspects like F-Zero GX and Rogue Squadron 2, they're not going to play at a very good speed, but for most of the other games in the GameCube catalog, this is going to work really well. Okay, so we've seen the performance now, let's talk about what I like and don't like about this device. We'll start with what I like. Number one, I love the form factor. This thing is so small and portable, you can take it with you wherever you want. It's also silent, which I didn't think was going to be a big deal, but I ended up really liking it. And like we just saw, performance is pretty dang good. And the installation process with Batocera and a microSD card is very simple. And lastly, I appreciate that this device is on Amazon. It's going to make shipping very fast, and then returns are very simple in case something goes wrong, or maybe you end up not liking the device. Okay, so now let's talk about what I don't like about this little PC stick. The first one here is that it has a bit of a lag when it comes to the Bluetooth connection. And surprisingly, I'm not talking about the controller, I'm actually talking about the keyboard and mouse experience. I found that using a USB keyboard and mouse instead of Bluetooth made it a much snappier experience, so something you should keep in mind. That being said, there are only 2 USB ports, which means that you're probably going to need a USB hub if you are going to be plugging in things like a keyboard and a mouse and a controller. All those things are going to add up and you only have 2 ports to work with. And finally, this device is somewhat pricey. I'm not saying it's a bad value, what I am saying is that it does cost a little bit of money. The retail price on Amazon is $250, but like with a lot of these devices they sell on Amazon, it does have this little coupon thing you can check and that's going to take $13 off. So now we're looking at $237. And if you're looking for the most budget PC available, you could definitely go on eBay and buy a used desktop PC for under $100, and then throw in some new components and all of a sudden you've got a really nice emulation rig. And that's going to cost you less than $200 altogether. But at the same time, that's going to be nowhere near as portable and convenient as this little PC stick. And I think that's really going to be the sticking point when it comes to this in general. If you want to have something that's ultra portable and be able to boot from a microSD card, then this might be one of your best bets. Personally, before all this pandemic stuff happened, I was on the road all the time. I spent about half of each year traveling to various parts of the country and around the globe. And if during all those travels I had had something like this to take with me to plug into my hotel room TV, that would have been super awesome. To be able to access my own library of retro games and be able to play that wherever I go in a very small form factor like this would have been super appealing. And I think that's going to be the main draw of this device here, is whether or not you have a need for a portable PC. For example, you want to have something that'll allow you to check email or something very quickly, but then also transform it into an emulation PC that's going to play up to GameCube with relatively little problems. So, in the end, do I think this device is worth your money? And of course, I'm never going to say just a yes or no to anything, but I will say that if you have a need for something that's portable and sleek and something you can maybe hide behind your TV or take with you on road trips or family trips or things like that, then this is a great fit. It's kind of amazing that we're at the point where we can take a PC and throw it in our pocket and then plug it into a TV and play all the way up to a GameCube library on it. That being said, if you're looking for a replacement for your current PC, then I would say that this device is not a good fit. I personally can't see myself using this as a primary Windows PC, it just doesn't have the power for that. So in summary, this is a really good arcade cabinet PC or something you could use as a portable solution. Otherwise, I would stick with a used PC or save up your money for a more powerful full-size PC. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm interested to hear what you think about this little device. As always, thanks for watching and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.